My name is Mark Newell. I'm an archaeologist, and we're standing on the riverbank of North Augusta, a small town by the Savannah River, a site where there were a great many potteries that were part of the Edgefield stoneware tradition. 5 historic potteries, in fact. What I'm going to show you is down here on the ground beneath my feet, a small mound of earth, but when we begin to pull this dirt aside, we can immediately see fragments of pottery. Typical brown stoneware made from the rich clay beds that were on this riverbank. 14 feet of clay, which is ideal for brick making and for pottery. As a result of this clay bed, an industry cropped up here, and it was mainly brick making, fire bricks, but also stoneware, pots, bowls, whiskey jugs, syrup jugs, everything needed on a frontier homestead, which at one point that's where the frontier was, right here in North Augusta. This is typically called a pottery sherd. It was thrown away by the potteries when they were here because it's what's called a waster, part of a broken vessel fired in the production process and damaged or destroyed and then thrown away. This is stoneware pottery with a brown Albany slip glaze on it, and was doubtless part of a whiskey jug. This is the dome, this is the shoulder. This is the kind of material that can actually tell archaeologists a great deal about the kind of wares that were being made here 100 years ago by these potters and what functions they served. When we talk about waster material, this is really what we're talking about most of the time. Rather than small pieces, we're looking for pieces that tell us a lot more about the pot itself. This is what we would call a diagnostic sherd. The advantage of something like this is it tells us a lot about the actual shape and form of the vessel that the potters were making on sites like this. Here, for example, we have the top of a 1-gallon whiskey jug, although it could have contained many other things: syrup, oil, turpentine, but commonly whiskey. The important thing about this is that when we see a number of these handles, there is a very distinctive way each potter makes his own handles, and we can record that, and then when we see intact vessels, we'll know where it came from. They also have a very distinct way of making their necks, and this particular neck with the flat top, slightly indented side and a bead at the bottom, we know now is the handiwork of a potter called W.F. Hahn. So when we find something like this in a pottery, in the waster, in the ground, this immediately tells us how that potter worked, how his necks were formed, how his handles were formed. This is his signature, and it enables us to learn that much more about the wares he produced. This is typically a stacker jug. It's called a stacker because it has a shoulder on it, and that shoulder enables a collar to be put on this so that another jug can be put on top of it. A typical collar would be a piece of unglazed ware like this that sits on top. Another jug is stuck on top of it. That's why they're called stackers. And you can see here the ring left by the collar, so we know again that this was not the top jug, but probably one of the bottom, and certainly that collars were used to stack these in the kiln. These will be stacked as high as they can inside the kiln to pack as many in there as possible. The glaze is also important. This particular dark glaze is what happens to Albany slip when there's less oxygen in the atmosphere. It's an attractive glaze, it's cheap, it comes from Albany, New York in a barrel of powder, and was used throughout the United States. Very commonly used down here in the South. There were other glazes. Here is another sherd. This obviously is not a stacker jug. This has a very handsome dark mossy green glass glaze. This is created not by a powdered material like Albany slip, but by ash glaze. It's made from wood ash. It's made here on the pottery site, and because it's green, it's most likely iron ash from an oak tree, which has a lot of iron in it that produces that green color. But again, a sherd like this tells us that this was most probably a large ovoid storage jar. From the shape and the curvature we can determine how wide it was. From this rim, this little piece of circumference will tell us how wide the actual mouth was. And then looking at the body, we can tell what kind of clay was used, how skilled the potter was when he made it. This is a beautiful piece of work. The finished pot itself would have been a highly collectible piece of Edgefield stoneware. Sometimes we're lucky enough to find something on a pot that tells us a lot more. For example, here you can see a stamp, and this stamp says Hankinson. We do know that Hankinson owned a brickworks here on the North Augusta riverbank. He went into the pottery business with the brother of W.F. Hahn, a man called Thomas Lafayette Hahn, and together they made jugs here for a good many years. And this one tells us manufactured by Hankinson, Augusta. North Augusta was always referred to as Augusta in those days, even though Augusta was the other side of the river in a different state, Georgia. But they didn't make that distinction locally. This was a large 2-gallon stacker jug, and again, because of the other sherds we've seen, we know the kind of handle, we know the kind of neck. This tells us quite a lot about the additional sizes of the jugs that Hahn's and Hankinson's and others were making. Here's another example of a sherd. This is something with a very distinctive handle, very distinctive form. This is probably either a chamber pot or a milk pan of some kind. And fortunately, again, this is stamped by the potter, JGB, for Joseph Gregory Bainham. This is a pottery that comes from Trenton, South Carolina, not here on the riverbank, but a fine example of how a sherd tells us a lot more about the products and the shape and the form and the glazes at a particular pottery. Little pieces of pottery can tell us a great deal about who was here, what they did and what they made, and in that way give us a glimpse into the lives of the people of the past that were once part of the history of North Augusta.